Right now in Miami, key negotiations are ongoing between the Ukrainian and American delegations regarding the points of the peace plan. It is reported that at the meeting with the Ukrainian delegation, the United States wants to resolve three key unresolved issues regarding, as they call it, the exchange of territory with the Russians and regarding security guarantees for Ukraine. Americans are also very concerned about holding elections in Ukraine after the peace agreement. And here it is very important to keep an eye on what is happening. Because right after the negotiations with the Ukrainian delegation, all the points of the peace plan agreed upon in Miami will be taken by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Moscow for discussion with the dictator Putin. The Kremlin has already announced that the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will meet with Steve Witkoff before his visit to India. This will be around December 4th or 5th, and here we have the first details of the negotiations between Ukraine and the United States. And, as it became known, the envoy of United States President Donald Trump, Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll, tried to intimidate Ukraine and its European partners with the worsening of the peace agreement, saying that the longer you think about it, the worse it will get. He also demanded that Ukraine give up its territories. And now sources in the White House admit that their team is strongly demanding that Ukraine quickly reach an agreement to end the war. And in this episode, I'll explain why they're in such a hurry. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. This is crucial for YouTube promotion. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links in the description of this video. So, right now Ukraine and the United States are holding a new round of negotiations on the peace plan. It's taking place in Miami. The Ukrainian delegation is led by Rustem Umerov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. Plus, the delegation includes the head of Ukrainian intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov, and also Andriy Yermak's advisor, Oleksandr Bevs. There are also representatives from the General Staff, Armed Forces of Ukraine, Foreign Intelligence Service, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Security Service of Ukraine, and Ministry of Defense. It's interesting that from the very beginning of the negotiations there was some confusion, and it still remains to this day. For example, Rustem Umerov initially published a post saying that the negotiations had started, but for some reason he later deleted it. Then, around 5:20 to 5:30 post-Meridian Kiev time, reports appeared that the negotiations had ended. It turned out they hadn't ended, just paused and were continuing. And this oddity, shows just how tense the atmosphere of these negotiations is. According to Axios, during the meeting with the Ukrainian delegation in Miami, the United States wants to resolve two key unresolved issues regarding territories and security guarantees for Ukraine. It is specified that during the negotiations in Geneva last weekend, Ukraine and the United States reached a fundamental agreement on all issues except two: territories and security guarantees. Initially, it was assumed that these issues would be discussed between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. But it is already known that Zelensky himself is now planning to fly to France to meet with European leaders and not to Washington to meet with Trump. And now, an unnamed American official has stated that the White House wants to resolve disagreements over territories and security guarantees. But in addition to this, the Wall Street Journal writes that the timing of elections in Ukraine is being discussed at the negotiations in Florida, besides the issue they call the exchange of territories with the Russian Federation. Let me remind you that this definition is fundamentally incorrect because we are not exchanging anything with the Russians. A territory exchange with the Russians could mean giving up the Donetsk region in return for the Belgorod region. That's what an exchange is. What the Americans call an exchange is not an exchange, it's trading Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian delegation, led by National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustem Umerov, has been in Miami for several hours. And on the American side, the participants in these negotiations are United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio, then Steve Witkoff, and the United States President's son-in-law Jared Kushner. Apparently there's already a position called the President's son-in-law. Right, and these negotiations are taking place at Steve Witkoff's exclusive golf club Shell Bay. Well, I really hope that Marco Rubio will maintain a more or less reasonable tone during the negotiations. And it's important to keep an eye on these negotiations, because the plan agreed upon in Miami is the same one Witkoff will take to his meeting with Putin in Moscow. The Kremlin has already announced that the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will meet with the special envoy of the United States President Steve Witkoff before his visit to India. Around December 4th or 5th, roughly the 4th, but the Kremlin hasn't given a specific date. Well, and don't forget that the same Steve Witkoff, who is actually directly supporting Russian interests, is participating in the negotiations in Miami today, based on his actions and Western media publications. For example, it was revealed how Witkoff blocked Tomahawk missile deliveries to Ukraine. Bloomberg reported that they published a transcript of conversations between Steve Witkoff and Putin's aide Yuri Ushakov. And in this conversation, the American official and this leak of conversations outraged American senators and politicians who began demanding Witkoff's dismissal. But the White House demonstratively ignored this outrage, and then even came out in defense of their negotiator. Although surrounded by scandals, Trump said nothing is serious. Witkoff continues to handle negotiations and next week is flying to Moscow. But as they say, it's not just about Witkoff. The envoy of United States President Donald Trump and United States Secretary of the Army Daniel Driscoll tried to scare Ukraine and its European partners with the worsening of the peace agreement. He also demanded that Ukraine give up its territories to the Russians. This is already being reported by the Financial Times. Specifically, Ukraine's first Deputy Foreign Minister Serhiy Kyslytsya told the publication that Driscoll seemed active, interested and willing to listen. However, the conversation in Kiev was not smooth and one of the high-ranking officials from Europe described the tone of the meeting. Driscoll. It depends on the notebook, along with the fact that the fulfillment of the AV was not handed over. Along with, he cannot be guilty, at the same time he should not be guilty in this. He will not be guilty among themselves. Address. Kohl stated that the territories Ukraine does not want to give up will end up in Russia's hands anyway. He also tried to threaten with a worsening of the agreement, and next I'll quote Driscoll. There are cities and places that are the subject of disputes which will end up in Russia's hands. It's only a matter of time. If we don't acknowledge this, then a decision about fighting must be made. How many lives are you willing to sacrifice? This won't improve the agreement. It'll make it worse. Well, first of all, that's completely Moscow's rhetoric. That's the Kremlin. 11 years of Russia's war against Ukraine tells us that the further it goes, the worse it will get for you. Then we won't reach an agreement. Secondly, Driscoll should remember that there are no disputed territories in this war. There are occupied territories, and that's what's disputed. For example, in the war between Thailand and Cambodia, there are disputed territories because those countries haven't been able to establish a border for several decades. And at the borders, Lustedze Fed flies by, and there are also deportation amplitudes. He froze Moscow at the United Nations and IO-type Jesus will gather. Be proud. A dispute over territories is not really a dispute over territories. It's a war of wild Russians against a free Ukraine, which has said that we no longer share a path with these wild Russians. Well, in general, after these negotiations in Miami, the main news for Ukrainians will be whether the Ukrainian delegation in Miami agreed to territorial concessions or not. Here, we need to pay close attention to what's happening, so I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.